So I picked up a magazine from a popular newspaper many years ago, and on it said, know your football, then I'll give you £10,000. And I thought, well, I know football really well. I love doing all of the stats on it, so I'm going to have a crack at getting that £10,000. And the following video is the story of how that led me to start looking at and predicting where teams were going to be finished in the league. So quite a few years ago, there was an article in a magazine, and it said, know your football, then I'll give you £10,000. And I thought, well, I know my football. I've been doing this analysis for a number of years. I fancy £10,000. Unfortunately, I didn't win, but I was able to prove a point, because the main point of the article were around the difficulty of getting the prediction of where a team's going to finish in the league absolutely right. And the theory was that it was impossible. It's very, very hard to be able to do. And in fact, it says in here, which is why I'm looking very closely, it says it's 1 in 20 factorial, which was 2 sextillion, 432 quintillion, 902 quadrillion, 8 trillion, 176, and so on. Yeah, a big number basically. But as you all know, for example, at Cheltenham earlier this year, I managed to win on every single race at Cheltenham, and those were very similar odds, you know, ridiculously stupendous odds. And of course, when you look at a problem, it depends how you approach it. So this was being approached from a purely mathematical perspective, and from that perspective, it was almost impossible. You could arrange teams in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and at the beginning of the season and get it right. Now the reality is, it is actually really hard to be able to do that, and you always get little anomalies appearing, like Leicester not so long ago, which appeared to be about a 1 in 40 year anomaly. But generally there is a method and process in which you can actually detect which teams are likely to finish near the top and which teams are likely to finish near the bottom. But for me, it was sort of almost an accidental discovery, because I approached it in the same way that probably a mathematician would have approached it, in that I tried to work through the entire fixture list and look to see where teams were likely to finish based upon how they were going to perform and who they were playing and what the odds of winning an individual game were. However, that was a total mistake, because the correlation could be described much easier another way. And I was quite keen to understand, how to predict where a team was going to be, purely for the fun of it, but also, being a football supporter, you want to know what chance your team has got of being relegated or promoted, and so on and so forth. But the correlation came around by accident, because I wasted ages trying to come up with complex models to actually figure out how this was going to work and what was going to happen and when. And I was actually browsing through financial reports of football clubs when I just suddenly thought, well, actually, why don't I have a look and see if I can dig something out of those reports? Because teams that had lots of money, you would sort of hypothesize would probably do better than teams with no money. And a lot of football teams are skirting on the edge of bankruptcy, it seems, most of the time. And obviously they won't be able to buy in new players and so on. So I was primarily looking at that. I was looking at whether a team that had huge amounts of debt and other factors like that were going to end up being relegated. So if you wade through all of the reports and accounts of individual teams, you can dig out all sorts of information. And in fact, now that is a report that gets produced once a year anyhow, which solves a little bit of work. But nonetheless, all of those details of the financials of football clubs are freely available, and there's lots of research done on that. And it was that allowed me to actually figure out where teams are likely to finish in the league. Because you look at wages within the league, and they've absolutely skyrocketed. I'll put up a graph for you of how the Premier League wages have risen over time, especially in comparison to lower tier teams. But I did see an article in the newspaper, and I snipped part of that article to show you a comparison of how things have changed. Because it's really since the advent of the Premier League and the money that goes into the Premier League that wages have absolutely skyrocketed. So the newspaper article, which I'll bring up on the screen somewhere here or somewhere, basically said that in 1986 Manchester United spent £2.5 million on wages, and if you wind forward to 2016, their wage bill was £210 million, so it's gone up pretty much 100-fold. For comparison, they looked at Shrewsbury, and they spent £250,000 on their wage bill back in 1986, and you wind forward to 2016, and that was £2.5 million. So that had gone up tenfold, But, you know, when you take into account inflation and all those other things, that wasn't a massive increase. But of course, Man United had absolutely skyrocketed. So the general thing that you get is that obviously if you spend or are able to spend more money on bigger wages, then you tend to attract the bigger players and they tend to stay around for longer, and that tends to lead to an outperformance. So when I was browsing all of this data, that's when that dropped into my head, and I was thinking, well, hold on a second here, you know, there must be a correlation, because you could definitely see one on the other side. So teams that were financially struggling necessarily couldn't bring in the players, couldn't fund development and all of those other things, and would eventually drop out of the league. And you know, you saw this cycle of teams generally falling away when they got into financial trouble. So I just went back and backdated. I'm just going to look for it here, but I'll bring it up on the screen for you in a second. I went and backdated all of the wages through all the information sources I could get and the final league position, and you come up with a chart like this. And basically the blue bits at the top indicate that a team has spent a lot of money on wages, and the column next to it indicates where they finished. So necessarily you can see a lot of blue at the top and a lot of red at the bottom. Otherwise you would, if the correlation was negative, you would see blue at the bottom on one side and red to indicate where they finished in the leagues. But you can see that generally that is performing exactly the way that you'd expect. There's a positive correlation between how much you spend on players, their wages, and where you finish up on the league. And that's a bit sad, really, because when I was growing up, everything seemed a lot more level. You know, you always felt your team was in with a chance. But when I watch my team, and I'm sure the same happens to a lot of other people out there, you feel that you haven't got a hope in hell against this team that have just spent $500 million on players. Or, you know, look at Neymar and PSG. They've spent $250 million practically on one player, which is absolute madness. That's more than the, you know, I mean, it's just crazy. Anyhow. But, you know, you can see that there's a rough correlation there going backwards, and generally that holds firm going forwards. So if you look at the individual wage bill, I'll bring up a graph of the wage bill that has occurred over time now, and you can see how this has affected the outcome of the league. So if we look, for example, at Manchester City, who are favourites to win the league this year, what you will find is that in the early 2000s, or the early turn of the millennium, you will see that their wage bill was no different to most other people, and they were just an average team. But you can see around 2007, 2008, they started to spend massively, and that has been rewarded with a number of trophies, including the Premier League title. Now, you can see that if you go to the right hand side of the graph, in 2016-17 they had the biggest wage bill of the lot. So that is basically saying that they've got the best chance of winning the league, and if you look at the odds, that seems to confirm that particular fact. But it's also interesting to look at it from a perspective of any of those other clubs as well. So for example, Man United, you can see, have been spending a lot of money for a lot of time, but they were outspent by Chelsea for a period of time. So the fact that they were less dominant when Chelsea came along, you know, that explains that as well. But you can also see that, you know, managers that are immortal in terms of what they've managed to achieve very often just spent a lot of money, and that was how they did it. But not always, because, you know, some managers don't spend as much as other clubs and are able to outperform. So for example, if you look on the chart and you look at Spurs, you look at Tottenham, you can see that they're spending way below what most of the other clubs are, so they're performing miles above what they should be. And if you look, for example, at Liverpool, I know Liverpool fans are frustrated through not having won anything for a very long period of time. Well, won the league rather, because they have won other things. You can see why that reason exists, because for a while they were pretty much on par with a lot of the other teams. But then over time, you can see that they've just fallen further and further behind the bigger spending clubs. So performance is relative. If you don't spend as much as some of these other big clubs, then you're going to fall behind, which is exactly what Liverpool have done. However, by appointing a good manager, then you can outperform, and relative to your position within the league. So it's very interesting to see. You'll also see on here, I've plotted Aston Villa, who are no longer in the Premier League, but you can see that their graph goes along pretty much flat lines and actually goes into decline. So relatively speaking, according to how much money they're spending, they're getting worse in terms of their position within the league, and they were of course eventually relegated, which is the way that you spot it. Clubs that carry large amounts of debt, or can't fund interest payments, or having to not spend in order to achieve something, are likely to underperform. over the long term, and that's, you know, an unfortunate fact of things. So yeah, I'll bring up another graph here. If you look at relative wage bills of clubs, this gives you a much better understanding of what percentage share each individual club has of the spend within the league, and that gives you a good indication as to where clubs sit within that particular mix. So you can see Arsenal are below the top three, so that would predict they would finish fourth, but you can see Liverpool would finish fifth, and Spurs should be finishing much lower. Now, because they're playing at Wembley this year for their home matches, it'll be interesting to see what impact that has. But if they don't perform as well as previous years, and they haven't spent during the summer, so their wage bill, relatively speaking, is in decline, I would expect an underperformance this year. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. But generally, you will find that teams that spend a lot of money end up winning the league or getting somewhere near the top. Teams that can't spend money or don't have the money will end up somewhere near the bottom. But the interesting thing to note is just outside of that top tier, you tend to get a band of underperformers. So if you look at teams that are expected to finish 6th to sort of 10th, you tend to find that there's a team within that mix that would generally underperform. Sometimes it could be structural. So for example, Newcastle spent a lot of money for a lot of years on a lot of decent players, but never ever achieved anything. And likewise at the bottom of the league, if you look above those bottom 3 teams, or the newly promoted teams, or the teams that have no money, there's a little band of outperformance there. So teams in that little area, you get one team out of that little mix that will tend to perform much, much better than you would typically expect. But outside of those structural inconsistencies, I have no idea why that is. I can't explain that at the moment, but I can tell that that is the situation that prevails over many years. I've analysed the data over about 25 years. Outside of those inconsistencies, then generally the team that spends the most amount of money will win the league, and the team that spends the least will end up being relegated. So as we go into the new season, bear that in mind. Don't get too upset if your team can't perform well relative to others. It very often comes down to money. And hopefully with that your team will have a decent season, but you'll also be able to have realistic expectations as to what they're likely to achieve. So anyway, hope that was useful for you. That is how you predict where your team is likely to finish in the league.